into the Learned Society's questions that were put forward in the main themes from yesterday's plenary. So welcome everyone. Do feel free to pop out if you happen to be in the wrong room. The way that we're going to run this today is that this will be made up of two individual discussion sessions. We'll do a quick swap in between. So feel free to stay because they will be different discussions, different themes, and different items addressed. Or do feel free to visit any of the others that will be going on. We're going to try to stick to time. Unfortunately, that means that this session will be a little bit shorter than we originally planned. But a quick round of introductions for our experts on the panel. We have Hetan Shah, who is the Executive Director of the Royal Statistical Society. He is responsible for the overall strategy and management of the RSS. His previous roles have included running the national charity Think Global and senior think tank, and he's also had senior think tank roles. He's the visiting senior research fellow at the King's Policy Institute.
We don't need any more.
And he's also, what I found really interesting, just as a fun note, he's on the Impact Advisory Board for the Big Lottery. We also have Catherine Cotton, who is the Chief Executive of the Federation of European Microbiological Societies, which is a body of over 50 scholarly societies focused on applying scientific excellence in solving the major problems facing global society today. Kath is a former academic and is committed to the challenge of translating research excellence into effective impact on the ground. Since leaving academia, she spent almost 2 decades in publishing, environmental campaigning, and science advocacy, working for Greenpeace International, Springer Nature, and BMC. Sally Hardy, at the very end, is CEO of Regional Studies Association. Her background lies in geography, but she began her career at the Economic and Social Research Council before moving to the Regional Studies Association. Yes, okay, wonderful. Let me just start off with a pretty obvious note, which is that this community, if you will, of learned societies is greatly diverse. Many stripes, many, many colors. Diversity in geography, size, discipline. No single solution for an organization will fit all others, but we certainly are pleased to have a group of the executives running their respective learned societies across a smattering of the different types that we will be talking about. So again, this first session will be addressing the question of new economic models, or shifting economic models, if you will. To take a note from Hetan's talk yesterday, his encouragement was to be bold, and we do see quite a number of learned societies who are trialing, experimenting, and have adopted new types of revenue streams, new services, etc. So I'd like to start off with a compilation that I put together at a high level, listing out some of the roles that at least these learned societies are playing: publishing, conference and network events like a congress, research funding and awards, international networks, influencing change, policy mobilization and campaigns, as well as professional development. Let's talk about some of these services. Are they a part of your economic model, or are they supports for them? Let's just get a sense of what the landscape looks like. The way that we'll run this session is very much as an informal, larger discussion with you in the audience. So if you would like to speak, to add to or add a question, continue some off of the back of some of the comments, please do give me a visual cue and I'll run the microphone over to you. All right, I'll start off perhaps just to give each one of these panelists about 5 minutes to talk about some of their economic models.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you for coming to the session. So I run the Regional Studies Association, which is a medium-sized social science learned society. But in preparation for the meeting, I thought it would be more interesting if I also looked across some of the other learned societies' strategic plans and try and make an assessment about what they're doing in terms of their shifting economic models. Not entirely altruistically, I must add, because we're just doing the review of our own. So I might start by just reflecting a little bit on what 8 different societies are looking at in terms of economic models. And the new ideas that I see coming through in the written documents, one of the primary ones is a new concentration on the importance of equality and diversity. And that's come through in several of the plans that I've looked at. And particularly that diversity is looking at the role of women and gender in terms of learned society representation. Organisations like Academic Mammal Watch are coming up that are targeting conferences that put up all-male panels and all-male plenary speakers. The second very, very strong message coming from the learned societies that I've looked at is one of the need to diversify income streams. And that's absolutely critical in the social sciences, where what we see across our society sector is a small number of large societies for whom, on average, publications income is around 16–17%, and then a bulk in the middle for whom it's around 40%, and then the smaller organisations take most of their money from conference income. So diversification of income streams is something that we're greatly exercised by. Overarching those two things, and then I'll stop, is a shift in the way that the boards of the associations are regarding what they do for their members. So it's a bit Churchillian. So instead of saying, what can my learned society do for me? The shift now is to saying, what can I do for my learned society? So we're trying to position our societies as sort of movements. And there have been a number of surveys. One was done by Aptify, Community Brands 2017. And what that showed is that people of all generations value code of ethics, the sort of the intangible benefits, representation, growing the field. Those are the things that that members are putting a value on. And I think in societies, we tend to be a bit concentrated on tangible benefits that we give to our members. So I think that will be a shift for us.
Yeah, good morning, and thanks, Jennifer, for inviting us to contribute to this session. It's interesting so far hearing so many of the contributions that have been made to the conference chime very much with what we're doing individually as scholarly societies. I think that one of the things that we face as scholarly societies, particularly within biology and maybe social sciences and arts and humanities compared to physics and chemistry, is that we're hugely fragmented. So we're very small organisations, often finding it quite difficult to really know what's going on. And even as big journal publishers working with a commercial publisher, it's very, very difficult to keep track of, well, what do we want to ask our publisher to be developing on our behalf? I sort of noticed with a certain degree of horror this morning that the session was described as economic models that we're rolling out. We're definitely not at the point yet, unlike the work that Hetan's been doing. We're not really rolling out things at the moment, but we are looking at the situation that we face. And as a federating body, rather than a scholarly society, it became very clear that FEMS is kind of a microcosm of the scholarly society sector. So we have 50 scholarly societies as our members, not individuals. We make virtually no income from membership at all, and are hugely dependent at the moment on publishing. But of those 50 societies, I think 8 of them publish and the rest don't. So our membership is hugely diverse, much more diverse than is represented in this conference here. So the vast majority of our members don't really have any source of income other than membership, and they find membership fees incredibly difficult to bring in and track. And so we're the source of benefits for most of the societies that we represent, and we're the source of income for many. And so it became kind of clear pretty early on that competing with our own members in order to serve the same community is kind of a perverse approach. And so it's got us thinking much more about how do we work together, leaving it to the later session, but where are the economies of scale? And how do we address the hugely diverse needs of tiny societies in the Balkans and larger societies in the UK? And how do we work with, for example, the American society, which is about the same size as all of our societies put together, productively, so that we work collectively to benefit that community and the whole scholarly society community, rather than competing with each other for the same pot of money. So it kind of raises a few questions, and then I'll stop. You know, where is the market? Where's the new market for potential access to expertise. I think you've been looking at this quite a bit. How do we reduce waste within the existing system? Does it have to be all about making more money, or are there other ways that we can be more efficient? And I've just asked my third question second, which was, does it need to be money? And I think you've talked about this in terms of what can members bring to the society. The society at the end of the day is trying to facilitate greater influence for its members. And we can't do this alone. We have to do it with the collaboration of our own membership.
So I spoke pretty extensively yesterday, so I won't take too long, but let me try and cover a few key points. One which I didn't talk about yesterday was one of the lucky things that I inherited at the RSS, and this may be true across many learned societies, is that it was so inefficiently run that there was actually a lot of scope to make it more efficient. So that was my starting point, actually, that by making things more efficiently run, there were all sorts of pots of money that I could get hold of and then redeploy in a better way. So that has to, I think, be the starting point. I obviously talked yesterday about growing new sources of revenue. Training was the big one that's being a real success for us at the moment. I didn't talk very much about fundraising and sponsorship, but that is an area where we're looking at growing. The difficulty for us is having really clear products that people would want to contribute to. The project I talked about with working with mathematical societies in Africa was something we were able to go out to our membership and seek for sort of crowdfunding for as a start. And then we actually had, as I mentioned, a publisher come in and support that afterwards. So that's a project where it was very tangible, but most of what we do doesn't have that kind of pluck at the heartstrings approach. So it's trickier to find funding in that space. And I also talked about the slightly wildcard project of the ISO standard, and we'll see whether that goes or not. With something like that, you've got to keep a very close eye on it and kill it if it doesn't work, I think. And that's the sort of mentality you've got to have. But I think my wider point that I'd make is you've got to remember that revenue generation often fails. So I think the Learner Society, I feel this generally, Learner Societies are about 10 years behind the wider charitable sector. That's true across governance, but also in terms of issues around revenue generation. So charities have, for the last 10 years, been thinking about these questions as grants have been drying up. They've been looking for new sources of funding. Often their boards have said, go and set up a trading arm, and they've had these astronomical projections saying we're going to bring in X amount. And more often than not, you find that actually they're loss-making, because you put all sorts of investment in on the basis of big funds and big returns projected, and they never actually appear. And I mean, there was a story very recently, I've forgotten which big charity it was, but they're just about to close down their trading arm for exactly that reason. So I suppose having said that we've got to be innovative and look for new sources of income, let's not be under any illusion. There may not be any, and that's the hard point. And I suppose it brings me back to my first point, which was we don't have a right to exist. The idea that we're here doesn't mean that we will be here in 10 years' time. It's not a given. And I suppose secondly, I would say we must focus, echoing your point really, on impact, not necessarily on growth. So that don't take your eye off the ball of what it is you're trying to achieve. Get a good sense of actually what level of resource you've got. Be innovative in changing that in whatever way, but ultimately, don't destroy your reputation or kind of mortgage yourselves into the future on the basis of money that will never come.
Yeah, I think some of the other ideas that came through sort of build very much on what Kath and Hetan have been talking about. When I did my reading, societies seem to be looking to internationalise their membership, both in terms of traditional kind of aspirations for increasing the number of members, but particularly for looking at an impact from those members abroad. So definitely internationalisation is on it. But the other shift, which I found significant, is a move towards shifting the focus and the theme of the society. And I arrived very late yesterday, but just in time to hear the closing question where you reference that you've taken some issues of data into the RSS. The Regional Studies Association has moved clearly into the field of regional science. We have one of our new open access journal is Regional Studies, Regional Science. So we're annexing an area which is served by its own learned society. It's slightly different, it's nuanced, but definitely it's shifting. And I am seeing some of my colleagues in the other societies looking at how they can grow a little bit the breadth of the association. And that does make me wonder if we might be moving into a period where traditionally societies have been quite collaborative, but I wonder if we're going to become quite competitive as resources become more difficult. So I wonder.
I have another sort of area of thinking which stems from the last point that I made about does the revenue have to be money? Or putting it another way, does it have to be money that we bring in and then disperse out in some way, whether it's as small grants or as services to our members? And whatever research you ask, what is the barrier to their career, it's always going to be funding. And if you look at the figures on H2020 funding, for example, I think in the first 100 H2020 grants that have been, or funds that have been dispersed, it's cost about 1.4 billion to get in research funding of 5.5 billion. So there's a huge amount of researchers' time and energy spent on wasting 1.4 billion euros out of a grant for only 4 times the size of that. And this dovetails with the impact agenda. So particularly in the UK, but I think also in the Netherlands, the issue of translating science, and there was a fantastic talk this morning about tracking the grey literature and looking at impact in a more tangible way. It seems to me that there's a phenomenal potential there for scholarly societies to be brokering, contributing to the parts of the the parts of the funding proposals that don't rate, and I was talking to somebody directly about this yesterday, the funding proposals that relate to scholarly communications. There was something on LinkedIn recently about how the academic community is confusing impact with activity. And the more meetings I organise and invite different audiences, then the more impact I'm having. And at the same time, the research community in the social sciences is starting to say, well, is any of this impact work actually having an impact? Is it actually translating into solutions on the ground? So I think there is potential to look at this area. And I'm hoping that you're seeing ahead more competition. Again, I hope that we can
manage it.
Yeah, have collaborative competition, is that the phrase?
Yes, I think that is a very important distinction to make, that impact is not revenue. And to keep them separate means that perhaps even that the question about revenue might be expanded when we're thinking about converting potential impact, right, as a separate concept in itself into then revenue, right? Mm-hmm. Going back to the question of generating revenue and economic models, I want to dig in a little bit deeper into the challenges of this process, if you will. In one, exploring new areas or new channels, and 2, implementing them as, say, a test trial or a pilot, and assessing how well they're doing. And finally, what are the expectations of timeframes when we're evaluating how well or the test is going? Can you, panelists as well as anyone in the audience who has taken part in this, speak a little bit on any of those?
I mean, one of the issues is investment, right? So, I mean, to do something new, you have to put some, it might be existing resource, but none of us really have a lot of existing resource lying around. So how do you get that initial thing to scope an area and then put the investment in? And I mean, what we've done, as I mentioned yesterday, we put our membership fees up by 30%. That led to a growth in revenue. And we were very explicit to the membership in saying we're doing this so we have an extra buffer of cash to invest in new areas for the long run, and that's what we've done. So we've been going to our council with projects year on year saying, as well as our balanced budget for the year, here's a request from reserves for 30,000, 80,000, whatever it might be, which is to invest in a new project area, which may or may not come off. And we're in the fortunate position of having, a reasonable level of reserves for the organisation, so we're able to do that. But I think to be able to do something new, you have to have money to invest in some way.
So I think investment's really interesting, isn't it? Sometimes you have to invest even if you think you really can't. So Brexit is a good case in point. The Brexit decision, which for mainland Europeans I really regret, it was a real shock for my organisation because UK membership is a minority membership. Our membership is global. A lot of our members are EU nationals. We have very good partnerships with the EU institutions. We're the preferred partner for the European Week of Regions and Cities, which is run every October. So the Brexit result was a flurry of emails and phone calls, both from our own members and from our EU partners, regretting the decision and regretting that they wouldn't be able to work with us going forward. So that's the kind of external shock that makes learned societies react. My association took the view, my board took the view that it was something where we couldn't afford to wait and see. We actually, because it created a huge credibility gap between us and our partners and our members. So we've moved ahead and we've opened a private foundation in Belgium, which has a legal identity. It has indirect control from the Regional Studies Association. We're one of the permanent board members as an organisational board member, and we will almost wholly fund it in order to enable us to continue to serve our members within Europe, but particularly to have the impact, the ability to go into the institutions and represent our members' work, put our members onto their high-level committees and so on. So yes, sometimes the investment has to come with all the challenges that come with running a new organisation.
Absolutely. Have there ever been any instances where a significant capital outlay have not been required in order to start an experiment or a pilot with a new revenue channel? Might there be other ways rather than having to, say, invest in that? Okay.
Well, we are doing this at the moment with funding work. So we started a pilot program on where could we potentially contribute to assisting in developing funding proposals for European funding, because we are a European federation. And we've had some success with this. It hasn't translated into research funding yet, but there's we worked on 4 different pilots, 4 different types of funding proposal, and 2 of them have gone to the next stage now. During this process, we're obviously trying to learn where are the points where we could usefully contribute. And I think some of it boils down literally to administration. So the administration time spent by researchers, I'm not saying that we would do it, but we can identify that this is time spent. I think one of the things that we probably all find is that academics have a tendency not to count in their time or their secretary's time or their principal investigator's time or whatever when they're looking at how much work costs. Whereas we see this as an area of huge potential to save research time so that the research community can spend more of their time on research and the communication thereof to some extent. So this is an area where we haven't actually had to invest anything other than, I think it was 0.4 FTE last year, and we're now in the process of evaluating that. Obviously the funding process is going forward. So we'll evaluate that this year and then look at it further.
Thank you.
So one of the things that we're trying to do as an association is to look more closely at our membership and understand our membership. And we have, I think, 4 or 5 different membership types, from student through to early career and so on. And we're trying to segment it, be a bit smarter about the way in which we think about our members. So rather than looking at tangible and intangible benefits by membership type, we're using a system of looking at them as super members, as rank and file members, and as value seekers. So each of those 3 categories applies at each of the membership types. And we're also looking at them in terms of which generation they belong to. So the millennials slightly different from the Generation X and the boomers. and then trying to see how we can, what's important to those people and how do we look after them. And I think the message that I get from members when I talk to them, particularly at American conferences, where members seem to be very open about what it is they don't like about the association and where we can make the improvements. So they're looking for a far more personal service from us. So we know, for example, that our super members like to have much more detailed emails from us more frequently, and our values seekers just get completely fed up if we send out dear member emails. They're not interested, and they unsubscribe. So we're really trying to work quite hard, and that's data that we have in the organisation, and it's just the time and the imagination to think about how we can manage it, and then a little bit of investment in our membership management system to make sure that we've got people with a values seeker or a super member. It doesn't mean that we think of them any differently. We still value them as members. They're just looking for different things from us.
Oh, that's fascinating. So you're taking your existing data, you're characterizing them based upon what you find, and then provisioning additional services or enhancements to better reach effectively that particular group.
We're trying to.
Okay, that's really interesting. Hetan, you also spoke about having a better understanding or more effective outreach to professional, to your different membership bands based upon where they fit in their professional advancement, in the hopes of, say, converting them into, from students who are no fee to those who are paying fees. Can you expand a little bit more about how that's going, or how you managed to do this, or what you're doing?
Sure, it's very early days. I suppose the first thing to say is that to a membership organisation, everything was viewed through the lens of membership. So when I arrived, our database only had members listed on it, and there was no other real way of interacting with it. So one of the things I was keen on us doing was having external stakeholders who are not members, so politicians, the media, et cetera, and so that was the first step. The other step was, what about your potential pipeline of members? And we all know that young people at the moment can't afford to join an association at the early stage, but they may be able to later. So we've created in fact, a couple of non-member categories. So one is an e-member, which is a free student membership. That creates a pipeline. We've had 2,000 people join in 2 years, so that's a really fast-growing category. And I know lots of other associations doing that. The other thing we do is you can become a non-member supporter of the RSS, which doesn't cost you anything. And it's much like many organisations where you just get an email 3 or 4 times a year telling you what the organisation is doing. Now, viewed purely commercially, this is our marketing database. We might be selling courses, we might be selling our conference. There's lots of people who no longer want to join an association, so we're introducing premium pricing as a mechanism of getting hold of some of the benefits, as it were. On the conversion from students to full membership, it's way too early to tell, but the point is, I hope in a decade's time, my successor as chief exec will thank me for having created this pipeline, as it were.
I think this is a really great example of how societies are really different. We're both kind of social science societies, but the Regional Studies Association, we've had a decade-long project to changing the hair colour in the room, because we were tending to all grow old together. I employ dye. But we've now moved to a position where 40% of our members are students and early career. And we define early career as within 5 years of completing your PhD or equivalent if you're in policy and practice. And we charge for that. It's forced us to address the services that we provide for those young people, mostly young people. So we do things like early career plenary speaker competitions, where early careers can send in an abstract and a video abstract, and then we will choose 3 or 4 of them and put them into a plenary session at our annual conference. We have early career grants, small grants, £10,000. We know that their career's starting because we watch people change institution once they've got the grant. And we also have early career editors on our journals. It's highly, highly competitive, very normal for us to get 50, 60, 70 applications to be an early career editor on one of our journals. And those are time-limited appointments of 3 years. And after that, normally what happens is they're taken on as a full editor on the journal because they become so good and they have relatively more time than people who are later in their careers to do the role. So it's a different approach. We also, though, do the kind of the e-membership where you get the newsletter. That works very well for us as well. So it isn't one size fits all. Lots of models flourish.
Yes, very good points. I think we have only a few minutes left, and our audience has been awfully bashful, but we have, let me take the opportunity. Okay, let's see, if we need the microphone, I'll pass it over.
It's actually a question. I love academic societies because I do think it's a great publishing model because it's based on the quality, so that seems core. But I'm aware of the fact that all of you on stage are people whose societies are still existing. Can you say anything about whether you've seen churn? Do you feel like the last people standing, or do you feel like actually it's getting better? What's
You mean?
Well, for people have said that the entire move towards open access has actually bankrupted a bunch of societies. So there are societies that are no longer here because they were relying on income, right? And so I'm asking, to what extent is this a real problem? So you guys are all people whose societies still exist because that's why you're on stage. So can you say anything? Do you know anything about whether or not there are societies that have ceased to exist, or was that scaremongering by people who don't like open access, or what's going on with other societies?
Chip in. I was around in 2013 and I sat on a chief executive's committee for the Academy of Social Science. Were you? No, not at the time. It was absolutely not scaremongering. There was a real feeling that there was a cliff edge and that societies would lose a large amount of income. And it was particularly we felt it very hard in the social sciences because we have a lot of medium-sized societies. And as I said earlier, roughly 40% of most of those income comes from publishing. And that is enough to mean that they couldn't pay any staff. So it did look and feel a bit like a cliff edge. Of course, open access hasn't rolled out in the way that I think the advocates at that time hoped it would. There's been more of a kind of slope, and that slope goes up and down, and it's different in different countries. So I personally don't know of any societies that have stopped trading. I do know that all of my CEO colleagues on that committee are looking at their strategic planning. We're all having conversations about what are the good ideas, how can we diversify our income stream, how can we better meet the needs of our members, how can we reach out into the worlds of policy and practice, how can we demonstrate impact. I mean, I would throw something back at the publishers in the room. I would absolutely love a model to come where the publishers can help us to put academic content in front of policy and practitioner audiences. And I'm sure that's something that we should all be working on, because those are the sorts of things that will lead to learned societies continuing to have an enduring role in the future.
Yeah, I think I would sort of echo that somewhat in other comments that have been made to date here at this venue, is that, yeah, I mean, open access is an issue. I think if societies had to all shift to open access immediately, given that we've got journals that have been going for decades, then it would have been much more of an issue. But with the transition period, we've been able to plan and make that transition more cost effectively. But I think in a way what is more of a barrier, or at least an equal concern at the moment, is, I know we've just talked about it all morning, but it is we're going to publish in Nature regardless of what else we believe, because of the brand recognition, which is fair enough, and the impact factor. And this has massive consequences for the other types of content you can publish. So if we're going to compete in terms of impact factor, we don't really have the, moving on to economies of scale, to run loss-making journals. So the big publishers with large portfolios across a discipline can afford to support, you know, much more innovative loss-making publications, looking at different article types, trying to reach different audiences. And this is something that we are looking at, but it's a very, very difficult balance to get academics interested in publishing this other stuff when they have careers that are still being built on publishing in high impact factor journals. Mm-hmm. So that still remains a bigger barrier to open access in a way than, as well, yes, it remains a bigger barrier to the intention of open access than the actual business model allowing access to content.
That is, in fact, a very good segue, but I'll let Hetan, do you have any closing thoughts before we wrap up this session with regards to, you know, the question at hand? Have you heard of any learning societies that have folded?
I mean, I'd echo what's just been said. I mean, open access was a threat. I just think that, as I said yesterday, there are a whole series of wider threats at the moment, and you may not see closure, but I think you could see organisations becoming defunct in one way or another, and that's the question. So.
Thank you very much.